If you've ever wanted to be a digital nomad, someone who works remotely, works from anywhere, works while traveling, whether you're a travel creator and you're traveling around and creating, or you're in the corporate world and you have some freedom of place and you can, for a little bit of time or for a lot of time, work from somewhere else. In today's episode, I'm breaking down things to consider because this is something I've been doing for a long time, and I'm excited to share some of the pros and cons from the different places that you can work from. But first, I want to kick off with a thank you to today's podcast sponsor, which is Safety Wing. Safety Wing is part of your consideration set, which is travel medical insurance. This is something that you should check out in advance because just from a few dollars a day, you can get competitive pricing and coverage while you're a digital nomad working and traveling. So check it out in the description below, and let's dive into today's episode. The best place to start is with 4 key questions to ask yourself. And all of these questions, as well as info about Safety Wing, is in the full blog post, so you can check that out in the show notes below. But these questions can kind of uncover, as we talk about these different places that you can work from and the pros and cons of each, what might make sense for you. And so the first question to ask yourself is, what kind of a worker are you? What kind of environment do you thrive in? Do you need to be around a lot of people? Can you be in loud places? Can they be distracting places and you can still get work done? Or do you need absolute silence? Or maybe you need absolute silence because you're in a lot of meetings. Or maybe you need absolute silence because fill in the blank. And so what kind of a worker are you? The second thing is, how connected do you need to be? Do you need really strong Wi-Fi? You need to make sure you're online all the time. Or do you have the type of work where you can be super disconnected and you don't need that kind of strong and secure Wi-Fi connection? The third question is, how serious is the work that you're working on? Is this like mission critical? You're about to launch your biggest project ever, or lots of people are relying on you. It's serious work. Or are you kind of in a phase of your journey or whatever it is you're working on that it's not as serious as it normally is? This is going to be a big factor in where in place. And the last thing to ask yourself is, how long do you have? How long do you have in terms of time? Are we talking about days? Are we talking about weeks? Or are we talking about months? Because that will also help you back into what might make the most sense. But if you're new here, welcome. I'm Christine Lozada. This is another episode of Everyday Badassery. This is part of what I call the Creator Series, in which I am helping creators, travel creators, or small businesses to be 1% more badass than they were yesterday in what they create or how their mindset is or how they run their business as an entrepreneur. And so this episode means a lot to me. Why? My background is actually as a digital nomad. I started as a digital nomad back in 2013. A lot of people don't realize I used to be in the corporate world for a long time in the office. And I switched over to working for a company who studied co-working spaces, who studied the way people work in office spaces. And that's because I worked for the startup brand called Turnstone under Steelcase. And as a remote employee, I could be anywhere I wanted to be. I just needed to be back in Michigan for 1 week a month to work with my team. And otherwise, for 7 years, I was a digital nomad working from lots of different places. Fast forward in the pandemic, I became a full-time YouTuber. Now I'm a travel creator. I travel and I create. And these are the places I'm going to talk to you about in today's podcast episode. I've got a half dozen places we'll be talking about, but don't forget, in the show notes, you'll find timestamps for all of them so you can jump around to the one that's relevant for you. We are kicking it off with RV travel. Then we'll talk about working from hotels and considerations around that. What about working from cruise ships? Ooh, what about those digital nomad cruises? Or what about long-term homestays, whether Airbnb or trusted house sitters? Or what about working abroad? What are the considerations I need to think about if I'm going abroad? Or what about co-working? Aren't there co-working hotels? Aren't there co-working spaces? Aren't there co-working camps? Aren't there fill in the blank? These are the different topics we'll be talking about, and in each, I'm going to be sharing with you the pros and cons. And as you're listening, think about those 4 questions about how you need to work and what kind of work you have going on so that you can make the right decision for you. Let's start with RV. Working from RVs, or in my case, a tricked out schoolie bus. So just for quick background, the way this worked for me was I was on a filming tour, a multi-month, multi-year filming tour for a brand, and I lived on their tricked out 38-foot schoolie bus. It was beautiful. They stripped it to the bones, rebuilt it, and the most important thing, one of the most important things that they put on this was Starlink. And if you don't know what Starlink is, it's basically a satellite that will connect to Wi-Fi everywhere and is one of the best ways out there to stay connected. So we had a humongous Starlink satellite that we would set up each day, and that was how I stayed connected. There are a lot of nuances to RV travel, but I share this story first because the first thing to consider is the size of the rig that you're in. In other words, if you're in a really large 38-foot bus, you can't just roll into any parking lot and just jump into the cafe and go work for a little bit. You are a very large bus and you are confined to places or bridges that are high enough that allow you to pass through. If you're in a van or in a Sprinter or in a small RV, that will allow you a lot more freedom. But from the perspective of you are in an RV, a large one, the pros of being in this space is that, well, you are in the place that you are working, or you can drive yourself to other types of places that you can work in. I would also say, though, the con is even though you might set up something like Starlink, if you need to stay connected, Starlink isn't insanely, everyone talks about how amazingly connected they are. That was not my experience. After spending a lot of time traveling all over cross country, I went from LA to DC and then back to Chicago on this bus and lots of other routes as well. We were not connected 100% of the time. And even when we were connected, the level of connection wasn't that great. And another thing to consider, that's another con, if you are parking at RV parks, their Wi-Fi is not good at all. I very rarely, like 1 out of 20, had a good experience connecting to the Wi-Fi at RV parks. And so just one thing to consider about RV travel, it's amazing because you're in the place you can work. Depending on the size of your rig, you can drive. Oh, let's pop into a cafe and work for a few hours. Let's pop into a co-working space. We'll talk about that for a few hours. Let's fill in the blank. You have that freedom of going to other places. But the other thing about working from the RV, or from my case, the bus, a lot of people are like, oh, you must have gotten so much work done while, when you were not driving. And so in this instance, I had Candace at Chasing Candace. She's also a certified bus driver. And so she would drive the bus and I would edit while we were in motion. And we'd be in motion anywhere from like 4 to 8 hours a day, sometimes 12 hours a day. And working from a moving, rattling bus was one of the worst experiences ever. I just had motion sickness all the time, and it's super hard to concentrate, and it's a very loud experience. So just think about your rig as you think about this setup. That might help figure out if it's right for you. What about being a digital nomad from a hotel? Well, obviously it depends on what kind and which type of hotel that you're staying in. But this is like 800 thumbs up from me. Hotels is my number one. Why? Because the Wi-Fi tends to be better. You have your own private room that you can take your calls in, take your everything in, and then also have shared spaces, whether in the lobby, in their cafe or restaurant, or by their pool, or fill in the blank, whatever it is, right? Every hotel is different. You have all these different other spaces that you can work from, but obviously the con is the price. On average, hotels tend to be the most expensive route. And so hotels, 800 thumbs up from me, but pro, great for working remotely, especially no matter what your style is that you need in terms of space, but the con is definitely the price. Let's talk about working from a cruise, because this is something I do a lot. And people always ask me because they see me on Virgin Voyages all the time and they are launching their own digital nomad cruise. Or separately, I see a lot of other digital nomads doing this, 7 days at sea, like let's all go together, work remotely and hang out on the cruise together. And there are a couple pros and a couple cons to working on a cruise ship. The first pro is that, oh my gosh, like you're already in the place that you work, whether you work from similar to the hotel, right? You can work quietly from your room, or you can go out into the nice spaces, whether, in the cafe or by the pool, fill in the blank, right? But it also goes back to like, how easily distracted are you? And what kind of environment do you thrive in? Because now, even though you might be on a digital nomad cruise or month on the med with Virgin Voyages as a digital nomad cruise, the actual number of digital nomads is the minority of people on that cruise versus the majority of vacationers, which means while you are quietly tapping away on your laptop or taking that serious business call, everyone around you is rage cage or quietly reading and enjoying on their vacation, but people are on vacation around you. And that is a very hard environment to thrive and do work in. When you're, sitting in the cafe, not next to other digital nomads, but you have a mix of people who are on vacations and, putting Irish whiskey in their coffee and enjoying that next to you. And so what kind of cruise are you actually on? Because a lot of people will mistake these digital nomad cruises for, every single person on the cruise is it? No, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna say it's impossible. In my experience, I've never seen a cruise where all 2, 3, whatever thousand people are all digital nomads on it. It's usually a portion of it and not all of it. There's a theme of it. The other thing that's a pro is Wi-Fi can tend to be good. It depends. So I've done some serious research on the speed of Wi-Fi on different cruise ships. And even, I would just say it's never been consistent, ever. Even when you pay for premium Wi-Fi. And I've just had a lot of sailings in which I've been with different people who have varying amounts of seriousness of being connected. And in general, nobody has ever been like, oh, wow, that was amazing. I was so connected. Like, that's just never been the case ever. And so this goes back to the seriousness of your work and how connected you need to be. Because even for me, just posting an Instagram story, it might take 1 hour and 36 minutes to post a 10-second video to your Instagram stories. That has happened to me before, and that was after paying for the premium Wi-Fi. So that's another thing to consider. The last one that is either a pro or a con, but just something to consider, is the length of time. And so a lot of times I see these digital nomad cruises being 7 days long, or even the month on the Mediterranean is literally a month. It's, 4 back-to-back cruises, technically. And so in each of these scenarios, cruising is not cheap. And so what's difficult about it is that you are paying a premium to be on a cruise, albeit even on the month on the Med, they do like a lot of discounting, but relative to being in a really nice hotel or going to a co-working space or even a co-working camp, we'll talk about that, it's relatively very expensive. And so when you're spending this time on the cruise, it's like, well, shouldn't you be enjoying the cruise? Like, how much time are you going to devote to the working aspect of it? Anyone I've brought on board with me who needed to do work always tried to do as bare minimum as possible and then went home afterwards to a pile of work. And so it just depends on where you're at in your journey of work and how much work do you actually have to get done. But a cruise is a vacation, and a lot of people see it as such. And so it's difficult for a lot of people to actually get work done, even if it is a themed digital nomad cruise. Just being honest. By the way, if you're listening or watching today's podcast episode and you have an experience doing digital nomad traveling and working, I would love to hear your story. Send it to me. I'm at Christine Lozada everywhere. I'd love to share your story in the blog post, which I will keep updated over time. Don't forget to check the show notes for info about that blog post, as well as today's sponsor, which is Safety Wing. And again, they are a digital nomad insurance, but this insurance is twofold. I talked in the beginning about how they offer medical insurance, but to expand on that, I mean, you can be in different countries. You could be at different ports while you're at cruise, for example, while you're cruising, without having to change your insurance. The other thing is that, you might have this trip planned in advance. You can make the start when that trip starts. It doesn't have to start as soon as you sign up, or you might already be on trip and you want to sign up immediately, and you can do that as well. So you can start it while you're away or in advance. But the second part of this insurance is that it's also travel insurance, which means if you have a travel delay, we've all had those, or if your checked baggage gets lost, they are a travel insurance also. So make sure you check out Safety Wing. Their info is in the show notes below, as well as in the full blog post. All right, let's talk about the next one, which is co-working. Oh, co-working spaces. I'm going to be honest, I love co-working spaces. And part of my old job when I used to be in the corporate world was spending a lot of time in hundreds of co-working spaces. It was my job to study them and the way in which people worked within co-working spaces and seeing how people thrive within them. And there's one thing I want you to come back to, which is that questions I asked in the beginning. What kind of a worker are you? Do you need silence? What kind of work do you need done? Do you need to be in private rooms, for example? Do you thrive in noisy environments, or do they need to be quiet? Because the pro about co-working spaces is that, well, there's fast Wi-Fi, that's for one. But the second thing is they tend to have a variety of spaces. Sometimes you might be traveling somewhere that has just one co-working space and you don't have a choice. And other times you might find yourself traveling somewhere, for example, in New York City, where there's lots of co-working space options and you have to choose. And so the thing I would recommend you do is think about the way in which you work and what kind of work you need to get done, and match that up to what that co-working space offers. Because I've been in co-working spaces that are literally just straight up open. They're just desks and they're all huddled together, and you just sit with other people and work, and there's no private spaces. I've also been to co-working spaces that have very few, and it's just a open cafe space, but otherwise everything else is closed office space. And so just match up the type of co-working space and vibe that you need to the type of work you need to do. The con of co-working spaces is the cost. And so I've really noticed over time, co-working spaces have gotten more and more expensive over time. Within the US, on average, I see them being anywhere from $35 to $50 per day for someone to just drop in and use it for the day. And you're sitting in the general communal space usually. And so they have become very expensive. But in terms of having a place where you can put food in the fridge and you can connect to fast Wi-Fi, and you can be amongst other people who are there to get work done, it's a really great option if you can afford a co-working space. Let's keep this co-working chat going with this idea of co-working hotels or co-living co-working spaces, which is interesting. I've had a few experience with these, and there's a couple things that you should look for. So when it comes to the co-working hotels that have co-working spaces, I think the most widely known one is Selina Hotels and Hostels. And I think what's interesting about this is that, there's a lot of Selina properties, and I've reviewed a lot of them on my YouTube channel. But what's interesting about them is that you can opt for the hostel stay, in a shared room, and then work in the co-working space. Or you can opt for a private room and then work in the co-working space. And the private rooms, well, depending on the location, oftentimes are less expensive than a hotel. And so it gives you that option for privacy as well as working together with people. But in general, like the Selena properties are tough because they vary in quality widely everywhere. And the other thing about their co-working spaces is while they can have like beautiful spaces with, you know, some private rooms, for example, like the air conditioning isn't necessarily on. When I was in Tulum, for example, they didn't turn on the air conditioning in that space, and there was tons of construction outside. And even if you went into a private room, it was just going to straight up be loud. And so it also just depends on before you sign up, especially if you're going abroad for some of these co-working hotels, for example, like really understand what the experience is like in the co-working space without just looking at the pretty pictures that they have well edited and perfect lighting when it's at its cleanest state, right? You need to dive in and get some like literal reviews of what it's like. And oftentimes I look to things like the forums, whether on Reddit or elsewhere, trying to find people's honest opinions about working there. Because if you are someone with time and you're going to a place for an extended amount of time, it is something you're going to want to research in advance. Another thing that I always do, especially for co-living and co-working, is I go physically look at the place before I sign up for it. And these are times in which I am traveling in a place for an extended time. I'm talking like month or months. And so when I was in Tulum, for example, I went to Outsite, which is a brand that has multiple properties around the world. And it's both co-living, you're living together with people, you're sharing a kitchen, and there's co-working spaces where you work together as well. And they all, you know, each space, depending on the country, they all look different from each other. But when I did a tour, I was like, you know, like give me I asked the front desk person for a tour of the place and kind of poked around to see what the co-working was like. And as soon as I walked in, I was like, this does not look like the pictures, and this is not for me. And that was because, you know, while the pictures have this really cool Tulum vibe, when you get there, like it feels like cold. And it didn't feel, material wise felt cold, but I mean, the condition, what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to tell you that the co-working space was not air conditioned. Sorry, I'm very upset by that because Tulum is hot AF and you have not only mosquitoes getting you, but you have a non-air conditioned room. So just really understanding what the experience is like before you sign up for it, especially long-term, is super important. But co-working and co-living spaces are another option for something to consider. Ooh, I do want to add one more helpful tip within there, which is you oftentimes in these scenarios have some kind of a concierge or someone that helps you, which means especially if you're traveling and trying to discover and understand a place, it's a nice way to drop in and get a feel for that by having someone's help while you're doing that. All right, let's talk about being a digital nomad abroad, working abroad, because, you know, don't we all want to do that? I have 4 cons for you. Obviously, the pro is we all want to travel and work abroad. It's so sexy AF to go abroad and travel. Like, of course you want to be a digital nomad in another country. But the first thing to consider is how supported will you be? And I say that in a few ways. One is, are you traveling to like a pretty remote place where they might not speak English and all the food will be really different and their way of life is really different than the culture that you are used to? Or are you traveling to a place where, okay, looks a little bit different, but I basically feel like I haven't left the US? Or you're in a place with a lot of expats and everyone speaks English, but all of the locals do not. Or what I mean by support is how foreign will it feel to you? Because the amount of foreignness and the amount of other things you need to navigate can be extremely stressful on the work front. In other words, in my experience, I have found when I've gone to very unique places to work abroad and be a digital nomad, it's been difficult for me to work because I'm spending so much time navigating like, oh wow, none of these people speak English, or like, wow, no one can understand me, or oh wow, like it's really difficult for me to figure out how to get from here to there, or like I'm just navigating the country and I'm wasting and using a lot of effort and time and energy on navigating the place instead of focusing on the work that I need to get done, and it really took away from that. And so I start with, how supported will you be based off of the place you've chosen? Because, if you drop into Bali, for example, at a place where a lot of digital nomads go and there's a lot of co-working spaces, that's going to feel like plugging in, and it's a little bit easier. So start with that. But the 4 cons to consider. One is the time change. So do you need to be working on a specific schedule? I know plenty of people. She's been on this podcast, Leah, Ticket to Anywhere podcast. She works abroad a lot. Wow. She will straight up work, 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. Like she will work through the night to stay on whatever time zone that she needs to be working on. And that's not easy for everybody. So ask yourself, what time zone do you actually need to be on? The next thing is around staying safe with your internet connection, and that's around VPN. And so especially if you're a travel creator, travel influencer posting on social media, like you need your phone to act like all these social media platforms, they need to think that you're in the US. Because when you start, being abroad and posting from abroad, well, what happens is you get an audience from that country that you're traveling to, because the algorithm, you need a VPN. And in general, both from that standpoint, as well as just keeping you safe, keeping your data safe, your internet connection safe, having a VPN, whether abroad and traveling like we're talking about now and being a digital nomad, or in any of the other scenarios, is really important. And so having a secure connection and a VPN is needed. The other thing is co-working spaces in other countries mean different things. Again, right? We're navigating what things mean in a foreign place. And so, for example, I have traveled to places in Mexico where their idea of a co-working space, come use our co-working space for the day. It's only $10 for the day. Cool. You show up and the desk is outside. Like, what do you mean? Oh, in our garden area. Yeah, it's 100 degrees and there's bugs everywhere. Like, I can't work in that kind of space. Some people thrive in that. And so understanding what your options are on where to work if you choose to work abroad is super important. And the last one pulls it back to the first thing I started with, was you're in a foreign place. And so navigating that foreign place and all the newness, making sure that that doesn't take away from your work, but also making sure you have enough time to be able to go explore and do all of the things that are out there. And so going abroad and being a digital nomad abroad is a plus. And I would say tied to all of this, whether in the US or abroad, are these like longer homestays. And a lot of people are curious about this because they're like, oh, what about trusted house sitters? I should try house sitting or pet sitting for someone. And I'll just say the horror stories are out there, and also the success stories are out there. It really depends on how you are as a person. And in the end, I signed up for trusted house sitters. I later unsigned up and asked them for my money back, because I realized that even though like a lot of these people's houses seem really nice and I am excited to go check that out, they are oftentimes, at least if you're not a trusted house sitter that's been around for a very long time, like it's really hard to secure them. It's really hard to get the really nice ones to opt in for someone who has 0 reviews, right? And a lot of times the ones that are available are either out in the boonies, or not the nicest homes, or have pets that require a lot of work, and that becomes another job. The number of people I know who have pet sitted through trusted house sitters while trying to work remotely and explore a place, and spent most of their time having to deal with a very, very difficult or very demanding animal, is a lot. And so this is just something to consider before you just jump on that bandwagon, because most people talk about the pros and how amazing trusted house sitters and I don't have to pay for accommodations. And there definitely is that pro, and there definitely are success stories, but you also need to keep it real and hear the other sides as well before you just try to dive into that. Obviously, long-term Airbnb stays, that's always an option. I'm always making sure I'm looking at the reviews for things like that. But trusted house sitters, something to consider. And there are other lots of like programs to that. I don't know, maybe if you've done it, share your experience. I'm at Christine Lozada everywhere, and I'll share it in the blog posts. So can you be a digital nomad, and can you work and travel? That's up to you. Start with those 4 questions, right? What kind of a worker are you? What kind of an environment do you thrive in? How connected do you need to be? How secure do you need that connection to be? How serious is your work? Do you need to make sure like you're getting it all done, or can you be a little more casual? And how long do you actually have? A lot of the times when I'm working and traveling, I'm always picking the place, backing into what I need at that time. What kind of work am I working on, and how connected do I need to be, and how long do I have? And then I pick the place, because sometimes you might need a month somewhere, and sometimes you might just need a couple weeks somewhere for a change of pace while you're working on something casually. And maybe it's a more casual, with a lot more exploring and traveling than working that you're doing. And so don't forget to check out the blog posts. I want to thank today's sponsor, Safety Wing. Be a smart traveler. Digital Nomad Insurance, both on the medical side as well as the travel side. Check them out in the show notes below. I'm Christine Lozada, and I will see you in the next episode. Ciao.